Everyone for attending this session. So my name is Pascal Joly. I lead the technology partnership at Quali. So just a little word about my first name, Pascal. Usually people in the US, they are not used to that first name as a first name, so they always ask me, so are you Pascal like the computer language? So how many of you have actually experienced coding in Pascal, right? So I did. That was my first computer language, actually, and that's when I realized that I probably would never be doing a career as a true developer. But that's for the side story. So today we're going to talk about a concept of sandbox as a service. And just give me a show of hands if you're already doing continuous deployment in your company to production. Okay. And then give me a show of hand if you're doing continuous deployment in production several times a day. All right. So it seems like today, we've had a lot of inspiring session over the last couple of days. And one thing that you have to face when you get back out of the show is that you have to face reality. And the reality is not often very pretty. If you consider mission-critical application and the way they are being released to production, it's either very, very slow or it's poor quality and very fast. So the point here is, can we find the right balance and not compromise your quality when you have the speed of automation? So a few of the pain points that I've heard over and over again and during a lot of the panels with financial services companies, for instance. Breaking updates, non-compliance due to things that were not forecast. Application complexity is certainly something that I've heard with all the new technologies coming along, and how to deal with legacy components that you still have to move to the next generation of application. The other point is a lot of missed deadlines, which means it takes longer than expected to release your application. So what I'd like to cover today, and if you want to tighten up your life jacket, is a few items here about challenges and solutions, and then we'll do a live demo and some Q&A. So just a couple of words about Quali. So we're a startup, privately funded company, about 100 people in the US and Israel, and we deliver what we call cloud sandboxes, which are a replica of pre-production environment. And we have about 300 customers in different verticals. So this is a little survey card that we issued as a result of a couple of thousand people that we surveyed last year on DevOps and barriers to DevOps. And it's going to be very aligned to what we've heard about the challenges of adopting DevOps in enterprise, in companies. And some of them that, so this survey, by the way, is available for download from our website. And some of these items that were really highlighted are around test automation, so having a robust test automation framework. Second aspect is around app complexity and figuring out how to model the complex application in your environment so that they can be reutilized and dynamically deployed. And then having to deal with legacy environment. So some of those challenges are very, very acute in traditional companies, not necessarily startup companies, although startup companies do have to deal with things like automation, test automation, and also app complexity. So since we're all engineers, we like numbers, and so this is the data behind the survey. And you see that it highlights some of the points I mentioned earlier about the time it takes to deploy those applications and deliver those infrastructure into production. The fact that you don't have self-service to those environments, and the fact that the application complexity is actually preventing you from moving faster. So a bit more on the application complexity. So here you see an example of a mobile app, and you want to simulate all the different pieces about that mobile app. And it could be a mobile app that's used in IoT, or a number of examples that I can think of where you have not just the mobile app itself, but in the back end you have a lot of infrastructure and servers that are distributed in private cloud, public cloud, and you have to figure out how to model that app and do continuous testing on top of it. So what you end up doing, since it's a very complex and time-consuming task in the first place, is to build your environment manually once. It's static, and then hope that things will not change, because otherwise you have to do it all over again. By the way, this is a picture in a park in Paris of, I don't know if you can make that up, a tractor made out of an old tree. So let's talk more about the automation journey. So if you consider that you have a center of innovation that you're going to be using as your lab, then this lab is going to evolve with the evolution of technology. And if you look at the different technologies that we have represented here on this picture, a lot of them are going to be very familiar to you. Cyber ranges and cybersecurity, SDN and FV, and then all the way to autonomous cars, IoT, fog computing. So your platform essentially and the application complexity is increasing, and your platform, whatever you adopt, will have to also support all those technologies, because you don't want to adopt each time a new platform, a new environment, sandbox orchestration platform for each new technology. So you want to be able to have something that stands the test of time. And so now that we have really ingrained the fact that automation is the key, and automation is going to be the vector for you to adopt innovation. You spend less time on manual tasks, and you can design, and the design is the key to innovation. Now you have to figure out, okay, what is the methodology that I'm going to use to make it happen so that I can have repeatability and I can have scalability. So here there have been a lot of talk about continuous integration in the context of our application and container deployment over the last couple of days. And here, this is really the piece of the puzzle that's the test automation piece, where each time you have a new environment that's being staged in your pipeline, you're going to plug in different types of tests, and these tests will be very incremental. So you want to have the smallest test as possible, as opposed to large end-to-end test, and then you want to automate the highest percentage as possible. And this is something that, in theory, okay, let's say I'm going to have 100% automation of my application, and I'm satisfied with that. But when you look at test coverage in reality, it's very hard to achieve numbers, close to even 80 in the 80% range, because you have all this wish list of tests that you think are going to be proof that your application is ready to be released to production. And then you have the reality of, okay, what among this wish list are the most critical tests that, and the rest of it I'm going to live with. And so this is very often a trade-off that you're going to have to make, because again, developing test automation is not something, you need a platform, you need a framework for it, and it's something that's can be time consuming and can be based on the amount of release cycle that you want to have in your application, because each test automation creates a little bit of overhead each time in your pipeline. So very important concept. That's a key part of your DevOps tool chain. Now, I made some updates on this slide based on what I've heard over the last couple of days on the message around continuous deployment, which is not an end goal but in itself, but eventually the vision is really continuous update. And so it's all very well and nice. However, just like extreme skiing, it's something that's still a vision and something that very few companies are able to achieve today. And you know them, they're the thought leaders, the Netflix of the world, and we've heard them, they're inspiring, but however, when you talk about mission critical application for healthcare, financial services, for example, this remains, kind of a distant future for them. So what is currently the alternative? We have many initiatives, even within traditional companies, to start small DevOps teams, start small, and then give them some autonomy to eventually be able to spread out the knowledge. And what ends up happening is that we have those islands of many different DevOps teams in the company, and then they adopt their own suite of tools, and it works fine for a very small scale, and eventually when you want to scale to the rest of the company, which is really when you get to reap the benefits of DevOps, then you fall short. And there were very, again, interesting talk about how some banks have been through the journey of accomplishing the standardization of those solutions, so that instead of point solution, you have some choice for the developers. And the Google keynote also yesterday highlighted that you want to give the developer choices about their IDE. However, you want also to standardize some of the main pipeline and orchestration framework so that everybody is not doing their own thing and have to support their own little suite of DevOps tools. So how do most people glue it together today? So this chart should be fairly familiar with you, and a lot of the logos here, it could be Legos as well, are going to be brand names that you guys have heard about. So we have a number of tools that are going to be responsible for your pipeline, and then underneath the hood we have a number of automation framework that people sometimes call infrastructure as code, and each one of them will have their own syntax, their own terminology and definition. And every time you want to plug in one of those frameworks, you have to essentially glue everything together, piece everything together in your own orchestration framework, which is not something trivial to do. And so not only this is very hard to model complex environment with some of those infrastructure, but also it's very hard to standardize and scale to different types of tool if you want to adopt, let's say, Ansible and then OpenStack and Mesos and Kubernetes using the same orchestration. So now I want to give you a little bit more color on what we call cloud sandboxes. And really what we want to encompass is not just your application in a test environment. What we want to include here are all the components, including infrastructure, including the data of the application, which is something that is very important for if you have an application that has a database in the backend with some specific field, about a loan application for a bank, for instance, and you want to retrieve that data and make sure that this is going to be used as a fail or pass criteria for your test. Another thing that we include as well in our sandbox are test tools, because you want to be able to link those test tools to a dynamic blueprint. And so as much as possible, you want to be able to control those tools from your sandbox. And I'll give an example in the demo of one of the tools that we've integrated with. So there are a number of features that are exposed from that sandbox, including the ability to model that blueprint, the ability to orchestrate. So it's not just a pretty picture, but it's also the automation on how to deploy this blueprint. And then the idea that this blueprint is going to be in a catalog as a self-service item that your developer can use and your test automation or your pipeline tool can use. So another thing is that the way you access the cloud sandbox can be either through a web UI or through REST API. And the reason being that in some cases, you still want to have some manual control. Like say you have to troubleshoot what's happening. Then you want to be able to log on to your portal, access your sandbox, and then fix up some elements and rerun some automation from there. But however, in a lot of cases, you want everything to be automated end-to-end. And as such, you want to be able to trigger that sandbox using a REST API. And then the deployment piece of it relies on existing cloud technologies. So all your infrastructure should be deployed in the cloud that you choose based on your constraints. So it could be any number of public or private cloud or container technologies. So if we review the different users that are involved in the creation in this process, so this is, think of it as a how-to for cloud sandboxes. The first person that's involved is your infrastructure owner, and traditionally it could have been either your application owner, the guy who knows the different pieces of your application, or the person who knows if you have hardware components about all your IT components, for instance, or maybe your Raspberry Pi tool. So here that person is going to create an inventory and model those in the system. And then from the modeling piece, for instance, at Quali, we adopted an open standard based on the Tosca standard. That's an industry standard, so that you can extend it and you don't have to rely on proprietary schema in your system. And then the next step is more of an architect. So the blueprint designer really is the guy who knows all the different components that are part of your application, not just the one piece that the developer will code, but everything around it. So it's the application itself, the backend, the front end, the load balancing components, the edge, if you have a distributed application in different locations. So then you put it together in a blueprint. And then from there on, you have a consumer. So a consumer could be a tool like Jenkins, or it could be a person who's going to deploy and test that blueprint and validate it. And finally, you're going to be able to release that blueprint once and promote that blueprint once it's passed your test automation. And then finally, you have a person who wants to control all the resources you consume as part of this process. So you have an infrastructure or application owner who's going to have visibility on all the different pieces that have been consumed, not only the test results, but also what are the resources those tests have been consuming? Because one of the things we've seen is that there is a lot of cost involved if you want to spin up resources in the public cloud for your tests, for instance, and you forget about them, or there is a lot of misuse of resources where you have your set of hardware that's dedicated for you, and then the person next to you has their own set of hardware, and then you end up duplicating a lot of this equipment, and eventually it sits idle most of the time. So you want to bring some efficiency to the whole process. So this is an example. This is what we have in our Quali product here. So you start from a very simple napkin drawing, and then what you end up doing is recreate that napkin drawing into this blueprint format that represents, in this case, different components of an application. So you have a web server, you have a testing tool like a SaaS platform like Blazemeter, and then some backend database nodes. So the next step after you model that blueprint is to publish it to a catalog. So what you want to do, again, is not the single little team who's going to do that once and they have one application, but you want to really spread out this knowledge and this capability to the whole enterprise. So it's really about scaling DevOps inside your company. And at this point, you want to have a catalog and categories and user, multi-tenancy, so different users can see only different blueprints, and have the ability to publish them either to API tools or to your groups of end users that represent your organization. So once you deploy a blueprint, it becomes a sandbox that's going to have different automation and orchestration implemented onto it. And so here, this is an example. You deploy a VM. I'm going to provision automatically the network connectivity to represent the different network segment, and then configure the application on the load balancer. And finally, if I have a hardware device, for instance, in the case of IoT, I could upgrade that device firmware. So these are the different things that are going to be owned by your orchestration, and that are going to be happening as part of the deployment of the sandbox. And then, of course, you have the ability to configure the test tools because you can read this blueprint, so you know the different relationships between different objects. And the part that I mentioned earlier is about the analytics piece. So everybody is data-driven. You want to figure out maximize the return on investment of DevOps, including all the assets that you're going to be using along the way. And that is, as such, you want to have reports about your costs, or how much this infrastructure is costing me, how many tests have been passed by, and who's been using those infrastructure. So all these are available in dashboards, and you should be able to drill down and recover all that information to present it to management and people who are going to be concerned about this. So now let's look at the orchestration piece of the sandbox. So we sort of reuse our previous diagram where we showed the pipeline. And now I'm showing also a list of tools. Could be Jenkins, Atomic, all those tools, you'll be familiar with them. They're workflow pipeline tools. And then underneath the hood, at each stage of the pipeline, we're going to deploy a sandbox. So the sandbox doesn't have to be the same, because based on what the test you want to perform, whether it's a failure testing, failover test, or a performance test, you might want to include different components in your sandbox. So it might not look the same, but the build that you deploy on each sandbox will be the same. You just want to have pass-fail each time. And the build will retrieve it from the JFrog Artifactory, and I'll go back in more details about that. So underneath the hood, you still have a number of tools that are used for configuration management for cloud deployment. So we want to make sure that we rely on the standard infrastructure and DevOps infrastructure that you guys are already using. So you shouldn't have to necessarily change all this infrastructure by adopting cloud sandboxes. So this is something that's important, is to be not tied to one specific very opinionated technology, because we know these are going to change. So you want to have choices, and that choices, we keep it, but we keep it underneath the hood from the sandbox standpoint. So let's now dig into one level down on the integration with Artifactory and XRay. So we've built a plugin, an integration that enables you, so that's one of the sandbox that's deployed, and we're going to zoom in to that sandbox on the particular application that's being updated. So we made a change on one of the components, and we want to push the build to it. So what we're doing is very simple. We deploy the VM, so that's responsibility of the sandbox. So in this case, for instance, Amazon Web Service. And once the VM is deployed, then we can connect to it and retrieve the build package. However, we know that the build package may or may not be clean, so we first have a criteria to check if the package is clean and is being scanned by X-ray, so everything is okay. Then you deploy it onto the Sandbox, and now you have a process where you can use Ansible to install it. Okay? And then once it's installed, then you can start your test automation on top of it. So let's now look at the X-ray piece a little bit more. So we have X-ray scanning continuously certain packages, and they're going to be tagged. So a tag could say that the package is not safe, a security breach, license issue, and here it's blocked. So if it's blocked, we detect it. The Cloud Sandbox will know about it, the plugin between the Sandbox and Artifactory will detect it, and then we'll just send notification to the user of the Sandbox that this package needs to be fixed. And then you can rerun your orchestration. However, if it's clean, then we can use the Sandbox. So it's just a simple decision tree that we have built here. And then you have also, the third piece is you have the ability from the Sandbox to scan a package. So if you want it, if the package, because the scanning is resource intensive, has not been scanned for whatever reason, we can control that from the Sandbox as well. So from an architectural standpoint, so I haven't represented all the distributed pieces on the on the JFrog side, because I know you guys are already familiar with those. However, these are the other components. On the Jenkins side, we have the Jenkins slave that's going to talk to our RESTful API. And then we have a server that's talking to distributed execution servers that are our way of essentially scaling our system and bringing local components if you have a very geographically distributed environment. And then finally, we retrieve, using the REST API, we talk to the JFrog Artifactory server, and we retrieve the package from there. So with Jenkins Pipeline, usually we don't even touch Jenkins Pipeline, and you've seen probably that workflow several times. We start with a Git commit that will automatically already has a plugin to Jenkins that will trigger the build in Jenkins and trigger also a package upload to Artifactory. So these plugin Jenkins own. And then at this point, the next stage, or one of the next stage of your Jenkins pipeline is to deploy the Sandbox. So you can deploy Sandbox. When it's done, you tear it down, and then you deploy another one. So this is really a simple workflow. Another thing that's important to highlight about Cloud Sandboxes is that they maintain state. So it's not a component that's it's ephemeral. So it's usually an environment that will last for a period of time and then disappear when you don't need it. That's the whole point. It's dynamic. However, it's something that during the duration of its lifetime, you can access through APIs, through automation. And for instance, here I give an example of a test that failed, or it could be a build that failed because it's not retrieved, because the scan has blocked it. And then you can go back into the Sandbox, access that resource, troubleshoot it, access the console of that resource, run a snapshot, make your updates, and then rerun the test. So that's an important concept of Sandboxes. So here in the demo I'm going to show in a few minutes, we're going to use Jenkins as a pipeline tool, and then JFrog Artifactory and XRay as your components that you guys are familiar with, and then an application that will be deployed in AWS and will use Ansible for the application installation, so an Ansible playbook. So now I'm going to go back to the lectern and then run that demo. So I just logged on to a self-service catalog. And here I have a number of blueprints. So what I'm going to show you first is sort of an interactive mode, where I'm going to show you the retrieval of a build from Artifactory. So here we have a blueprint that represents this application that I described earlier, that we call Flex, that has backend servers and a number of web servers and a BlazeMeter test automation service here that's going to run performance tests against those Apache servers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy that blueprint. And so here, as I'm deploying that blueprint, I select the time I want to deploy it for, but I could also add some input parameters. So that's the other thing. You don't want to have 1,000 blueprints, because every time you're going to change a little bit of information in the blueprint. So we have the way to parameterize certain aspects. For instance, you want to deploy in cloud AWS region west versus AWS region east, or just also the version of a certain component of the application might change, but everything else is the same. So that way you can keep the same blueprint, but just inject an input parameter. So here, this application, the setup orchestration is currently running. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch to an existing blueprint that's already deployed, so that you guys don't have to wait for that. So here I have this one that's already in place. So here, this blueprint has been deployed, which means all the virtual machines are up and running, and I can access them. And now I can start retrieving the build onto the machine. So what I'm going to do is try to deploy that build from Artifactory. So these steps here would be typically included in the orchestration setup, but for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to make it interactive. So I'm deploying the build, build 12 from Artifactory onto my web servers. So here what we're doing is we're going to apply each one of those web servers, try to install this build 12. And you see here I have a little skull that just displayed. And here I know that there is a critical security issue that has been detected, and it's returning an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at why I got an error. And it's telling me that a critical issue was raised, and I can go and take a look at my Artifactory server. And here you go, XRay has detected the issue. So I can start troubleshooting what happened, and then go back to my Sandbox, and then try to run the same command, but on a different build. So now I'm going to try build 13, and let's see if it works. So now I have a clean build, and now we should be able to deploy. And you see here it's turned on green. So we should be able to deploy this new build on each web server. So I can check here my output. We're deploying each application here, and it's succeeded. And I can just verify that just by doing a little web shortcut, and I see my simple application with build 13 that's been installed. So this is sort of, and then if I wanted to, I can run an XRay security scan from this same interface, or I can also start the BlazeMeter test. So the BlazeMeter test is going to call a BlazeMeter automation that has been configured with the information on that blueprint, and try to essentially overload that web server. So you see here that we have a little warning that tells you that the server has been overloaded. And then now the test has finished, and I can go and take a look at my output here, and I see that my report is ready. And so I can go in BlazeMeter and then look at my BlazeMeter report. So that's one way that you can actually validate interactively and run a test interactively. And now we have, obviously, a way that's more automated. So now I'm going to go to a different domain since I have access to multiple domains, and I'm going to take a look at my developer environment. So here, this is a way that we do to model the different tools that your developer would have access to, and this is also a good way to enable some new teams in the organization because you have all the tools here available from that sandbox. So here what I'm going to do is RDP into my developer station, and I'm going to, so this is the only line of code I'm going to change. I'm just going to change one thing in my HTML, in my HTML file. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but all I'm doing is just make a change into that file, and then I'm going to just save that change and go to my Git server, and then we're going to essentially look at the changes that we're making. So here, I want to make sure that my file indeed has changed. And then what I can do is I can go to my Jenkins server and then go here and look at my CI pipeline. So you see here that this CI pipeline deployed itself a number of sandboxes. So here this is the previous deployment that was run. And each time what we're doing is we're starting a new Cloud Shell sandbox, and we're starting a test and then tearing down the same sandbox. So essentially that's what we're doing. Eventually, once each test has passed, you deploy to your production environment. So let me now go back to the slides, and hopefully the display will be okay. Okay, can you guys see that? Yep. All right, so going back now to the slides. Okay, so just to sum up, what we discussed today. So there are many different challenges to broadly adopt DevOps in organization, and we reviewed and we heard a lot of them during this conference, including application complexity, a lot of manual processes as a result to set up your environment and run and validate your application, and then a problem with also legacy environments that are either left alone because they can be automated further, or they're going to be slowing down the whole process. So what we are able to do with Cloud Sandboxes is really tie these things back together. And not only tie it back together, but also bring this to the entire organization. So it's not just a one-team effort, even though you always want to start those efforts small, but it's also the ability to bring this as a self-service to the entire organization, multiple teams, and have the ability to achieve all those goals of reducing the risk of deployment, increasing the agility, so the time to deployment, and of course, bringing you the control on the assets that you're going to consume as part of this process. Because it's not just about deploying things and then letting them live their own life. It's about deploying, tearing down, maximizing efficiency at every single step of the way. And that's the only way you can really scale those types of efforts. So I've brought you a couple of use cases today, really around DevOps and continuous testing, continuous integration, where Cloud Sandboxes are very valuable. However, there are other use cases where we've seen a lot of interest beyond that. And one of them is around certification and compliance. So essentially doing certification of your security, for instance. Another one is cyber ranges, so it's more of a training platform to educate your SecOps team about security breach and security policies. And then another one also is DevOps Dojo. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of DevOps Dojo, but it's essentially a platform where you bring all those tools on demand, dynamically, so the pipeline tools, and these could be in containers or very lightweight VMs to different teams, and you allow them to get familiar with how they work. And that way, again, you can bring your DevOps practices to the next level for all your organization. So this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. Again, you have one team who starts an effort, and then you want to spread this effort across. So if you want to get your hands dirty, we have actually an SDK, and you can download that SDK from our website and play with Cloud Sandboxes. We also have all the content around Sandboxes open sourced, so including the Jenkins plugin, the Artifactory and XRay plugins, so you can also download them from there. And you can always contact us if you want to sign up for a live demo. So just to wrap it up, thanks for attending this session. And if you have any question. All right, thanks.